Hi, everybody. This is Kate Haley with Glazer's Camera here in Seattle. I hope you're all enjoying your Saturday. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, you might have awoken to a lot of fog, which honestly, I really kind of love. So I was like, I want to go out and take some photos, but I'm here with you guys. So maybe after the fog will still be hanging out and you can go take some photos in it. So today we continue our 85th anniversary. I think we're in our fourth week of these weekend sessions where we're focusing on different camera brands. And this weekend, we're so happy to bring you a couple of Panasonic sessions. We're going to be focused on some video techniques this morning or early afternoon. Sorry, it's just now noon. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about specific cameras and have discussions between Micro Four Thirds or full frame, like deciding what's best for you. But that'll be it too. We're going to talk about what we're doing right now. So we have Todd White with us, who is a Lumix ambassador. He is a filmmaker. I think he maybe does a little bit of still with that too. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about him and his work. If you have questions during this session, we'd love to hear from you. We'll do some Q&A throughout, so be sure to post those questions in the comments on the YouTube feed or on the Facebook Live feed. Now, before we get started, I just want to remind everybody, these live sessions that we've been doing for the past few weeks are to help celebrate our 85th anniversary in business as an independent camera dealer here in the Pacific Northwest. And that's a pretty phenomenal feat. Third generation family owned business. We have this beautiful store here in South Lake Union, which is open. So you are welcome to come in and shop, of course, and shop online. So lots of different options for you. I can mention that we do have some special promos. Like this is about bringing you education and inspiration, but we also have some great deals happening. And if you've signed up for this session, then you'll get a little email with those specials. If you haven't signed up yet, just go do that right now, or maybe right after the session, so you can be sure to get that email with those promotions. So without further ado, Todd, I'm gonna kick this over to you. Tell us a little bit about you, and then we can dive right in.
Cool. Well, first of all, congratulations on the anniversary. And I kind of wish that we could all celebrate birthdays or anniversaries for like 4 weeks now. I think you're doing this. So that's
Yeah,
fantastic.
it's a total of 6 weeks. Normally, it's a 2-day store in the sale. I'm sorry, in the store. I only had one coffee today, so. But
Hmm.
normally it's 2 days. It's crazy busy, but since we are still kind of limiting how many people are in the store at a given time, we thought this approach could be fun. It lets us also focus
Very
on
cool.
like having a Panasonic weekend, which we can't always do. So that's part of the joy. And like I said, there's some
That's
promos
awesome.
to be had. So yeah, it's pretty
Very
fun.
cool. Very cool. So my name's Todd White, and I am a videographer and a photographer located out of Austin, Texas. And let me just kind of jump right to my basic slide here. So I am a content creator, and started out doing still photography and have spent most of my time doing that. But just a quick little side note, I did 26 years in the corporate world, and I've been doing content creation of this type now for approximately 10 years, nine and a half, 10 years full time, and absolutely love it. And I'd say about 4 years ago, I dropped in video as one of the things that I really, really started to focus on. And so I do a lot of fashion and commercial work, and I shoot with a variety of different, whether it's boutiques, or whether it's fashion designers, done some project work with some people from Project Runway, and then also have shot everything from food to car commercials, and then also working a lot with Lumix. And you'd see some of my work also across the new S5 launch for Lumix. So just a lot of different areas and places that I definitely work in. And then also one of the things that I do is I produce with a TV show on PBS called The Day Tripper, which is a Texas travel show. And so won my first Emmy for producing work on that last year, and back on the road filming on and off throughout this year as well with that particular project. So a lot of different areas and a lot of different things that I focus on and that I work in. And one of the things for me that really has helped me with teaching a basic video class is taking my experience on the road, working on large projects, but then really trying to hone this down to the person that just wants to be a one person crew, getting out, shooting and creating content. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to focus on. I'm really going to talk about the basics. And so normally when I'm teaching this at our local camera store in Austin, I have a part where on the slide it says you can introduce yourselves. Obviously that won't happen here at this point. However, if there are some specific things that you would like for me to cover and make sure we touch on in the session today, by all means, put that into the comments and let's just make sure that I talk about that or at least address that, especially as we start getting toward the end, if there's anything that we missed, and then by all means, call that out and we'll jump into that. Also, I love being interactive. And so Mark and the others that are here online with me are going to be watching and monitoring the questions. And so if you've got a specific question about something I'm talking about, feel free to jump in. I love the interaction and engaging with all of y'all while I'm actually teaching. So with that, let's dive in. And by the way, just for the sake of saying it, with the exception of some of the generic pictures that'll show up on the sidebar, everything that's showing up on the sidebar as far as photos and stuff is part of my work, just as a side note for you guys. All right, so let's start off talking about cameras. When we talk about video, people sometimes think that they've got to have a really big fancy video camera to get out and start filming. But I'll tell you that the majority of cameras that we have these days actually have a video function in them. Whether you've dabbled with it or played with it at all, it's there. Chances are you've got that function. So I know that this discussion about full frame versus the smaller sensor will be talked about later today from my understanding, but I'm going to talk about it just in reference to video and in the context of what I'll be discussing here in a few moments. So when you're looking at the types of cameras that you have access to, there's always the full frame and then versus a smaller sensor, whether that's an APS-C sensor, whether it's a micro four thirds, or even a smaller sensor like a 1-inch sensor that you'd find in some of the smaller point and shoots. Point is that the sensor size is the piece that we're going to really talk about right now and focus on. So there's the size of the camera, obviously, but when you start talking about your sensor size, you're usually talking about a megapixel count, the size of the sensor, which can affect the sensitivity to low light, and can also affect the higher ISO capabilities of the camera as well. And then there's also just the features of the camera in general that you will have to weigh whenever you're looking at choosing a camera. Now, I'm not going to say that one is better than the other. Personally, I think that the megapixels on a camera is more important than whether it's a smaller sensor or a full frame sensor. And for video specifically, in that case, just for video specific and by that statement that I'm talking about. And then you're going to find different features, and we'll talk about some of those features here in just a little bit. But when you're looking at cameras that are smaller, you may not have as many codecs that you can do video in. You may not have as many picture profiles that you can film in. You may have limited audio capabilities as well. And the audio capabilities I'm talking about are going to be whether it has a microphone jack or a headphone jack and things like that. And we'll talk about some of that as we go forward. But cameras is the first choice, full frame, smaller sensor. And then we also get into the action camera category. So a lot of people really like shooting with a GoPro. And they've got their pros and cons. And so with the shooting with an action camera, just a few things to consider are going to be the size and the shape of the camera, the resolution that it can film at. Sometimes action cameras can have higher resolutions, not all the time, but sometimes they can. There's also the frame rates that tend to have access to and can film in some higher frame rates. So be able to go more of a slow motion type of a video with some of the action cameras than you can with your mirrorless and DSLR style cameras. So just something else to keep in mind. And then also very specialized use with an action camera. Now, I will say, and I'll hand it to GoPro, they've been putting out some, the past couple of their cameras have been pretty decent, and they've really tried to focus on that vlogging setup. Still not perfect, still not the best option, but they've been trying to break into that market with a smaller form factor of a camera for things like vlogging and such. But they're really for a specialized use. I know whenever I use them, and when we use them on our TV show, We're using them in ways that we cannot use one of our DSLRs or our bigger video cameras. Things like mounting them to the outside of the car, taking them up on a hang glider with us when we're 1,500 feet in the air and trying to get the right shot, putting them on one of the poles and putting them underwater when we're fishing or we're doing things like that. So there's very specialized uses. But then the other thing too with an action camera to be aware of is the field of view. They tend to be a lot wider and a little bit more distorted. So when you're thinking about adding that into the mix of how you're capturing footage, you just need to be aware of some of those things with an action camera itself. So when we're moving along talking about cameras, one of the things I also mentioned was the megapixels. So I am very sensitive to this megapixel race. Personally, for photos, it makes sense. And I do think there's a point where we just kind of like, it becomes a moot point where you just need to stop worrying about the megapixels in a camera. However, for video, it does really have an impact on the image that you capture. And so right now, there's a lot of these cameras that are out that are in this sweet spot that I feel, like the Lumix S1 and also the new S5 that have a 24 megapixel sensor. And 24 megapixels on a full frame sensor, in my opinion, is that sweet spot for that perfect hybrid camera of capturing video and also being able to capture still images as well. Now, when we talk about the megapixels, just to kind of put that in a little more context, as you can see on the slide here, when we're shooting at 720 as far as a resolution for video, we're barely using 1 megapixel for that image. When we're shooting at 1080, we're just above 2 megapixels that we're utilizing for that image. And when we start moving into 4K, we're still under 10 megapixels that we're utilizing to give us that image. So just by that quick little resolution and megapixel list there, you can see it's less important for a high megapixel camera for shooting video. Now, like I mentioned, for someone like myself, I do a lot of hybrid shooting. So there are times when I'm out with my clients and I've got my deliverables are going to be stills and it's also going to be video. So finding a camera that has that mix is really key for me. Additional considerations when you're looking at cameras, and we're going to talk about some of this as we move forward, but are going to be color profiles that you can shoot in. So do you have the ability to get more dynamic range, shoot in a flatter color profile, and have more flexibility in post-production? There's also cropping. So some of our cameras in general will crop at different resolutions and different frame rates. So just be aware of that. You may start off with a full frame, but when you start shooting in 4K and at certain frame rates, then your camera may crop in and actually take you down to an APS-C or a smaller sensor. Every camera is different in how they handle that. So I'm not going to just start going into all the different options there, but just know to be aware of that your cameras will crop when you push them to a certain point as far as the resolution and the frame rates are concerned. And then of course we have different codecs that we can shoot in, and the codecs are basically wrappers. They're basically how that file is delivered to you to be able to use with your computer. So kind of like a RAW or a JPEG. Well, we can shoot in like an MP4 or an MOV. So it just depends, and every one of those has their different little nuances about them. But just consider that as well whenever you're looking to pick a camera. Like I said, for myself, the hybrid approach for me, I really need a camera that can shoot 4K. And this is for my personal choice, 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. And I need at least 24 megapixels for the work that I do. Now, I do use a different camera sometimes whenever I'm shooting in the studio and I'm not worried about video, then I'll pull out a different camera, which is my S1R for that work. But for the majority of what I do, I'm shooting with the S1 or the S5. All right. Next consideration are going to be lenses. And there's so many different lens choices out there. And you're going to hear people talk about this and give their opinion. But I'm going to go from my experience, from my style of shooting, which is documentary, travel, fashion, that whole run and gun type of approach. So when we talk about picking a lens, the number one thing to look at is going to be, in my opinion, is going to be your aperture. When you are shooting video, I believe that an aperture around f4 is a really good sweet spot. And I would take even down to 2.8 is really great as well. So f4 and f2.8. And if you're wondering why I picked those two, the f4 is going to be a little bit less expensive in general of a lens than going down to a faster lens of a 2.8. And when you're shooting video, I typically don't need to shoot down all the way to 2.8 or even a 1.4. That's going to be a stylistic choice. But for most of the video work that you're going to do, an f4 lens will work out perfectly. In fact, one of the lenses that I keep in my kit as well is a 24-105 f4 lens that we have with the Lumix system also. Because when I'm shooting like a talking head video, doing an interview segment with someone, chances are I'm going to be filming that at like a 5.6 and even to an f8, because I want to make sure I've got focus all the way through the face and to the back of the head as much as possible, because it gets a little distracting when someone's talking and they're moving in and out of focus depending upon what that aperture setting that you have is. So I typically tell people an f4 lens, if there's a budget concern, an f4 lens is wonderful and perfect fit for shooting video. If you can go to a 2.8 and you're a hybrid shooter, then that's going to give you a lot of flexibility between video and stills as well. And really what the choice comes down to when you're looking at your lens for video and you're talking about the aperture, it's what's more important to you as a filmmaker. Is that nice creamy bokeh in the background super, super important? Or is focus more important? And like I mentioned, when I'm doing a talking head video, I want to have focus from the tip of the nose to the back of the head or just behind the ear, and keep that in focus, and it becomes less distracting for the person that's watching the video. Now, when I'm shooting B-roll, then all bets are off. I'm shooting at 2.8, 2.0, 1.4, and really liking that creamy background and that bokeh. Once again, it really depends on how you're going to be using the lens and what your primary style of shooting is. Also, wide-angle lenses are great. You consider a wide-angle lens. Depending on what you're shooting, like real estate, events, and things like that, wide-angle lenses are great. And one of the cool things about a wide-angle lens, and it's just the nature of how lenses work and the nature of physics, is that the wider your lens angle is, then the more that's going to be in focus. So I could take an f4, let's say like a 16 millimeter. I can take an f4 16 millimeter lens and set focus. I can also take a 2.8 16 millimeter lens, put both of them together, and you're going to really hardly notice a major difference in what's in focus or not with those two lenses if you're all the way out at 16. Because like I said, the nature of wide angle lenses is the more stuff that's in focus. So if you're shooting real estate and you're going to be doing a walkthrough of a house, then it's less you have to be concerned with as you move through maintaining focus. Another cool option that I like are self-contained zoom lenses. And so different camera makers and different lens makers will make these. And what I'm talking about, and I was looking to see if I had a lens to show you, and I do. So I don't have a self-contained zoom, but just for the sake of an example, we know that with our lenses, as we change our lens, the focal length, the lens itself actually changes in its length. And you can see that moving up and down here as I go from 24 to 70. When I have a self-contained zoom lens, one of the things that's really cool is I can move through my entire focal range, and the actual length of the lens or the weight distribution of that lens does not change. And where this is really helpful is if you're going to be putting this on a stabilizer, and if you're going to be balancing this lens like on a Ronin or a Zhiyun or something, then you don't have to rebalance, because when you balance a lens on a stabilizer and you start to change the focal length, then you end up having an uneven distribution of the weight. And so every time you change a focal length, you'd have to go back in and rebalance your gimbal. And so in the self-contained zoom, you don't have to worry about that. So you drop it on and you're all set. And so different lens manufacturers make those types of lenses. And so I do encourage you to consider those and look at those if you have a chance. Also, manual versus autofocus. So that may be a little strange, might be a little odd whenever we are talking about lenses of whether or not we want to do manual versus autofocus. But for instance, like when I'm doing a talking head video, I will very rarely set that to be an autofocus shot. I'll actually have my talking head person, my subject will sit, I'll focus on their eyes, and then I'll flip over into a manual focus. And that will prevent the lens from having to hunt or try to keep up with the person. Now, we've got great autofocus capabilities out there in our cameras, and they can follow. However, there is always that random chance, like I was doing just a moment ago while I'm talking and I bend down to go pick up a lens, then that could throw a camera off and create a little bit of a moment of out of focus and in focus scenario. So I tend to shoot a lot of my videos in manual focus. And then I use focus peaking to be able to see what's in focus and what's not in focus, besides my eyesight. But as we get older, that starts to fail. So focus peaking is key. So manual focus versus autofocus lenses, they are out there. So that's another option. Manual focus lenses tend to be a little bit less expensive than an autofocus lens. So that's another budget consideration also. And then I'm going to come back up and talk about prime versus zoom. That's another consideration as well. When I am shooting video, I tend to really focus on having a good zoom lens that I work with. I don't use a lot of primes whenever I'm shooting video. I will in some instances, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I tend to really focus on a zoom. That way I'm not having to change out my lenses as often, especially when I'm shooting fashion. I like the ability to be able to zoom in and get a tight shot at 70 and get some details, zoom out to like a 24 and be able to get a wider shot as I'm following my model and working, and then be able to zoom in. It's just nice to be able to play with that and to have that option. When I'm doing a talking head video though, and I have my subject set up in the frame, I will typically be shooting on a 35 for that shot, or sometimes I'll be shooting on a 50, just depending upon what's around and in the surrounding areas. Like right now, the lens that I'm using as I'm talking to you guys, the lens I'm on is a 35 millimeter, it's a 1.4. I actually have it at 2.8 right now because I'm going to be bringing things up into frame to show you guys. And so I don't want to have to be at a 1.4 where I have to bring it like right here to show you. So I've got that set about a 2.8 for this setting, but I'm on a 35 1.4 right now. It's a Sigma lens. It's an L-mount lens. It's part of the L-mount Alliance that we have. So prime versus zoom, love to have a great zoom, manual versus autofocus. And so down below is my list of the main lenses that I have. And I shoot with a 24 to 70 2.8. I use a 35 1.4, and then I've got a 50 1.4. And then I also, with my S5, I love that new 20 to 60 3.5 to 5.6 lens. Fantastic lens, especially whenever you're going to be doing something like vlogging. It's a really cool lens to have, and it's so versatile, especially with the macro piece of that as well, the macro function on that. So great set of lenses. Now, some people look at that list and they're like, well, wait a minute, why don't you have a 70 to 200? And for the work that I do, I really don't have a need for a 70 to 200. I think I've owned a 70 to 200 lens one time in my entire career. I think I used it for I had it for 6 months. I used it twice and just figured that it really wasn't worth keeping around and keeping in my kit. So that's a personal preference for me on the lenses themselves. Are there any questions that we have so far that are coming in?
So someone's asking about long GOP versus all eye. Those are codecs, I understand. Are you going to talk about that later?
Yes.
Okay.
We will definitely talk
we'll
about that in
later.
just a moment. Yep.
Okay. I'll tell them
Absolutely.
to hang in.
So we'll hang
That's it for now. Let's keep going.
Cool. All right. Awesome. Okay. The next thing that we talk about when we're talking about cameras and shooting video is going to be stabilization. So if we're shooting video, we want to make sure that that video shot is going to be stable, and then we're not going to have a whole lot of wobble that's going to be happening. So there's a lot of different ways that we can actually stabilize our camera. First off, for me, I really like using my Gorilla Pod. And so I've got this here that I'm showing you guys right now. This is the Gorilla Pod that I use. This is made by Joby. This is the 5K version. So there's different variations of this. I think there's a 1, a 3, and a 5. This depends upon the weight and size of the camera. And so this for me is key for me shooting video. And how I tend to use this is I'll have the camera on top and I will be holding my camera and I'll have my eye up to the sensor, I mean to the eyepiece, and have a hold of it by the Joby. And I'm filming and moving along like this. Because one of the points I make further down this list is the more points of contact to the body, the more stable the image is going to be when you're shooting handheld footage. So the more points of contact to the body, the more stable the image is going to be. So first and foremost, I use my Joby. Then we can also use a monopod. And so monopods are great to use as well. In fact, what I often tell people is if you're going to be doing video at a national park and even some of the state parks, check before you go. But a lot of them have actually banned the use of tripods now because they take up so much space. And so if you think about it, Yellowstone, when you're putting 50, 60 photographers trying to wrap around to capture that perfect shot of Old Faithful, then they have seen that tripods will definitely take up more space and not as many people can get in there to shoot that shot. So they're encouraging the use of monopods. So I always carry a monopod with me. Another cool thing about a monopod that I'll mention really quick is you can take a monopod and you can put a stabilizer on top of it versus putting your camera on top. You can put a stabilizer on top of it like a Zhiyun crane or the Ronin S or like the Ronin SC can screw in the top of that. Then you put your camera on top of that, and now you've basically have a poor man's jib, if you will. And so I've used that for many shots as well. And if I want to get high above a crowd, or I'm shooting an event or like at a concert or something, I can use that monopod with my crane up on top, and I can get that way above the crowd and shoot down and even simulate a low-flying drone shot if I need to as well. So the combination of a monopod and a stabilizer with the camera is a really cool option that you have. And like I said, it's like a poor man's jib to get those nice rising shots and higher than I can go with just my arms because I'm kind of short, so that helps a lot. Tripods, obviously, that's the tried and true way that we have been stabilizing our footage. And when you're using a tripod, and even with a monopod, I really think the most important aspect of that is going to be the head that you put on top of that particular tripod or monopod. So make sure that you get a video head. I'm going to show you one here. So I use the Suray brand of products. And so this is the video head that I use when I'm out filming. And the main thing with the video head is I'm going to have fluid motion. So your typical photography heads that you have on top of tripods are not going to be the best, especially if they're the kind that just have the little flip up piece to go vertical, flip down to go horizontal, and it just does the tilt. It's not going to be enough that you really need to be able to give you the most control when you want to shoot video. Because when you think about shooting video, we're going to want to get our pans, we're going to want to have some tilt, we may want to have a little of side motion just to get some nice sweeping shots. And so a true video head is what's going to be the best. And one of the key things about it is not only do I have the ability to do my typical tilts and so on, but I have tension that I can set on a video head. So it's not just one speed only, completely fluid, but I can put a little bit of tension back to that. And so I can get a little bit more smooth and deliberate with my shots. And also I like for it to have a bowl. And so the bowl piece lets, if I unscrew this, the bowl piece will actually let the head move in all directions all around. And so this is really helpful whenever I'm trying to stabilize the actual image itself. So when I get my camera set up on top of my tripod, then instead of having to do it the old way that we used to do, and we'd have to pop the different screws or the levers on our tripod and adjust the legs to level it off. Well, now I can put my tripod down on an uneven ground, and then I can use the bowl and I can stabilize my image by using the bowl, and I don't have to worry about finding a stable place to put my tripod. So that's a really key thing that I think you need to look at, is the right head that goes on top of your tripod. And then next is stabilizers. So I've already mentioned the Ronin S, and we also got a Zhiyun crane as one of the other popular ones that are out there. Now we get a little more expensive. So now we're moving on past just the basics of stabilization. We're moving into now you're going to spend, depending on which one you get, you're going to spend $500, $600, $700 range to get a stabilizer that you can use. But they are really, really helpful whenever you're doing certain types of filming. Now, I will say for me, I don't use my stabilizer a lot. I use it when I'm shooting real estate and doing walkthroughs of houses. I also will use it sometimes if I'm outdoors and I want to do a really nice sweeping 360 shot of maybe a model or my subject. I'll use that to do a 360 round. But a lot of times I'm shooting most of my work handheld with my GorillaPod. In fact, it's kind of funny. I've really worked out trying to be super stable when I'm shooting with that setup as handheld, to where some of the guys in the TV show, our editing crew, has had to put natural camera shake and movement back into my footage because I've worked out trying to be so stable whenever I'm shooting. And so sometimes they call me Tripod Todd when I'm on a set, and they're like, "Oh, Todd shot that. We have to add camera shake back into it." So quick example I want to show you. I believe they've got a video that they're going to pull up. And this is a really good example of how well these stabilizers can work. So I was working on a car commercial for a local Chevy dealership, and I was hanging out the back of a pickup truck with the Ronin S inverted upside down with my S1H onto that Ronin S. And I shot this particular car footage, and we were going down the road at about 60 miles an hour. And so you'll be able to see how stable that footage was. So if you guys want to roll that particular clip, this will show an example of how stable the footage can be whenever you're using a stabilizer like the Ronin. And like I said, I am hanging out the back. Whoop, different one there.
Let me get
All
that
right, so
to loop through for you. One moment.
oh, okay. I didn't realize it had gone all the way through there. It's all good. So like I said, I was hanging out the back of that down and shooting that particular clip for the car footage. And the other thing I had besides the S1H is I had a little Ninja 5 monitor that was helping me be able to keep the car in that particular spot on the frame, because we were matching 5 different car shots. So the car had to stay right in that particular space. So that's a really good example of using a Ronin S whenever you're shooting and filming. All right, cool. Thanks for sharing that. So as I mentioned before, at one point, the longer the focal length, you need more stabilization. So when I'm shooting wide, like at a 16, I can move around and it's not that noticeable. But the moment I start getting into 70, even like a 105 or a 200, that shaking and moving of my head becomes way more noticeable. And so it's harder to stabilize a longer shot, if you will. So stabilization is key when you get past 50 millimeters. Points of contact to the body, we talked about that. The more points of contact to the body, then the more stable the image is going to be. And next one is called the funny walk. And if I'm teaching this in person, I demonstrate this. But basically, is you want to lower the center of gravity. So when you're shooting with video, you tend to want to be crouched a little bit. And then when you walk, you're really kind of walking from the ball of your feet to the heel. Anything you can do to minimize the movement and shake of your body. Because one thing to note is whenever you're shooting with even a stabilizer, the stabilization works really, really well for up, down, side to side, but the body movement of our bodies doing this as we walk, the stabilizers really can't fix that and compensate for that. So we want to keep our body as level as possible whenever we're filming. So stabilization is also really, really key. All right, let's start talking and diving into more the technical aspect of like the camera settings for video. So we're going to jump into resolution right now. So there are 3 resolutions for here that I want to talk about and mention. First of all, I'm going to talk about 720. Some of the cameras, depending upon the age of your camera that you have, you may see 720 as an option. Most cameras these days are going to have 1080, 4K. Some of them will have 6K. Some may still show you an option of shooting 720. And that is one of our lower frames, if you will. Lower resolutions, if you will. One thing to note that I mentioned here is some cameras, some of the older cameras, will only record a higher frame rate, like 60 or 120 frames per second in 720. So just be aware of that. Most of the newer cameras don't have that issue, but some of the older cameras will. But we don't really ever use 720 anymore. Next is going to be 1080. So 1080 is the most common resolution that we have out there right now. So 1080 is what you're going to deliver most of your footage in. You can deliver in 4K as well, but really if you're going to YouTube, or especially if you're going to push it over to Instagram or something like that, you really don't need to shoot above 1080. It's a preference at that point. But 1080 is most popular for delivery and for filming footage. Most people's TVs, yes, you can go buy a 4K TV, but most people's TVs are still at 1080 as well. Then you've got 4K, obviously. Now, I personally will suggest that you film in 4K, but there are some different considerations when doing so. First of all, more storage is going to be needed on your card, and also more storage on your hard drive whenever you're going to have to store all that footage. So just be aware of that. And also, can your computer handle it? Now, prior to me teaching today, Mark from Panasonic and I were talking earlier today about this. And one of the things that we mentioned was, can your computer really handle it? And we talked about how some of the higher resolutions can bog down the computer and kind of choke up a system a little bit, depending upon how beefy your system is. And one way around that I'll mention, little side note here on the editing, is if you're going to shoot in 4K or even in 6K, which you can do on the S1H, you can always make proxies of these particular files when you're going to edit them in Premiere or even in Final Cut. And what proxies are is they're just a lower resolution version of the same file that your computer can handle and you can edit through quicker. You can apply all your effects, you can apply your color grading, and anything you need to do to that footage, you can do that. And then when it comes time to export, then the editing program will automatically then refer back to the original file and export that in its full resolution. But there is a way to get around the question of using 4K or not. And then my question here about, do you really need it? If all your content will only ever be displayed on Instagram, then you probably don't. But if you want to have that flexibility to put that content on television, on YouTube, and other types of media, whether it's going to go to the client, then obviously shoot in 4K, even though you might be delivering in 1080. And then just by default, that'll future-proof your footage. Now, another really cool thing that I tell people about shooting in 4K is that if I'm going to shoot in 4K, but I'm going to be exporting and delivering my footage and working with it on a 1080 timeline, I now have 50% more footage than what I need, as in more space. I have more resolution and more frame than what I need. So the cool thing happens is that now I can punch in and I can punch out without losing any resolution or clarity of my image up to 50%. So for instance, an example, if I was taking this video of me as I'm teaching right now, and I am sitting here at 4K, then I've got my full setup right here. And in fact, if we can cut over to me for this example, that may help as far as the visual. So if this is me full width here at 4K and all, I can now fake like I have a 2-camera setup by taking the full frame. As I'm talking, I can hide maybe my ums or my uhs, and I can punch in. And so I can go from 100%, and then I can take it down to 50%. And I can go like to 75%, back to 100, back to 50. And I can use these punch in and punch outs to cover up ums and uhs and other little things. Sorry about the noise, so it's my new puppy at the door. And so I'm able to basically be able to punch in and punch out and to hide those gaps and to utilize that full frame. And so that's one of the cool things about shooting in 4K and delivering it in 1080 is I have some options there. And it's kind of like taking an image in Photoshop and zooming in and having like a large 47 megapixel file, maybe zooming in, and I've got the ability to get in and get clarity with that. All right, so 4K, I recommend people film in 4K, but deliver it in 1080, and you can really enjoy those benefits. All right, now I've got here 6K and beyond, so who knows what's coming later on in the future. But I do know, like with our S1H, I can shoot in 6K. And so that just goes along with the same thing that I was mentioning about 4K. Can the computer handle it? And also it future-proofs your footage, but you do have a lot of flexibility. And it's again about framing and working with the footage and zooming in, faking 2 cameras. You can also even fake movement. So I've taken a 6K image, and instead of having a slider on set, I've been able to zoom in, punch into that, and then I can actually move that image across the frame and fake like I have a slider. So there's some really cool tricks that you can use depending upon the resolution that you're shooting in. So I keep referring to frame rates and mention that every so often. Let's talk about frame rates now. So frame rates are the number of frames or images that we're capturing per second when we're shooting video. So I can shoot, and I'll show this in a second, 24, 30, 60, and so on with the different frame rates that I have. And here's the big thing to keep in mind when you're talking about frame rates. As long as the frames per second that you capture and the playback match, then you will perceive natural movement, and you'll also be able to keep and use your audio. And when I talk about natural movement, when we're talking about using different frame rates, and I'll jump over here to the next slide. When I talk about using frame rates, when I get beyond 24 and 30 frames per second, I start to get slow motion movement. And if I shoot below 24 frames per second, then I'll start seeing more of a jittery movement that happens in my frame. At 24 frames a second, whenever you're watching that, there's a natural blur, there's natural motion and movement that happens that we see whenever we're watching just in real life and observing life in general. So 24 frames per second here is considered to be cinematic. And that's the most common frame rate that people shoot at. It's going to be 24 frames per second. Most of our movies, most of our evening TV shows, most of that stuff that's more cinematic style is going to be shot in 24 frames a second. Next, we have 30 frames per second. So a lot of sitcom shows, especially back in the early days, were shot in 30 frames a second. 30 frames a second just has a little bit of more of it has a crisper look to some extent, and it has a little bit more of just a jittery, just a certain look to it. I don't really know how to describe it, but when you look at 30 frames per second footage, you can really tell the difference. And especially if it's not been slowed down, then you can really tell the difference in just how the footage looks. A lot of times when people are live streaming, they will live stream actually at 30 frames a second. And so like right now, I'm live streaming in 30 frames a second. I'm not live streaming in 24 frames a second. So when we start looking at our footage, then when you get to 30 frames a second, then this is a really sweet spot between 24 and 30 as far as our audio being able to be useful and used and kept for use within our video clips that we deliver. So let me stop here before I get into slow motion and talk a little bit about the editing process. When I go into Premiere or Final Cut or whatever program that I use, I can choose to edit my videos in either a 24 or a 30 frames per second timeline. And as you see down on my notes below where it says audio note, that if the spoken word or the ambient audio that's recorded and I plan to use it, then I should not shoot that in a higher frame rate and the audio will be out of sync. So 24 and 30 are my 2 frame rates that I can shoot at that will match up to an editing timeline. And then at that point, my audio will be synced and it will sound normal. So 24 and 30 if your audio is important. Now we can start moving into shooting at 60 frames a second and even 120 frames per second. 60 frames a second is used for slow motion. And when you see slow motion in a lot of TV shows and even some movies, they're either being shot in 60 or in 120. Now, personally, this is my personal opinion right here. I'm going to say, I think that for most people that are shooting video, moving into 120 frames per second is actually too slow of slow motion. I prefer to be shooting at 60 frames a second for my slow motion. And we'll take a look at some clips here in just a little bit, and I'll further illustrate that point. But when I'm shooting at 60, my shot tends to resolve and finish off in, for me, a more comfortable slow motion time frame as opposed to doing it 120. Now, 120 frames a second, a lot of people like shooting B-roll on that. I think that's applicable when you're shooting things that are moving really, really fast, like sports, race cars, basketball, football, maybe dogs that are doing competition. Things like that work well for grabbing certain clips in 120 frames a second. So save that for fast action type of footage that you're trying to capture. But if you want to get slow motion of somebody moving, maybe you want to get slow motion of a chef working in a kitchen, 60 frames a second tends to really be just fine for that and capture what you need for sure. Like I mentioned, audio important. The audio will be out of sync if you take something you shot in 60 and try to use it on a 24 frames per second timeline and slow it down. The audio is going to be way off. So just note that. So let's take a look at some sample videos where we talk about the frame rates, and that'll be great for us to see how this looks. So each of these clips that I'm going to show you have been edited on a 24 frames per second timeline. So the first one that you see there is shot at 24 frames a second. So we got the pizza flip, which looks really great. And all of these are going to have pizza flips for them. I just wanted to pick something that was the same that we can look. This next shot right here, the one that's playing, that one is 30 frames per second, edited on a 20 frames per second timeline. So 30 on a 24 frames. And then this one here, this one is going to be 60 frames per second. So that one is 60 frames per second, edited on a 24 frames per second timeline. And then the last one that we'll take a look at is going to be 120 frames. And so see, that takes a while for that to resolve. It looks cool, but it takes a while for it to actually resolve and finish the shot. And so depending upon the commercial or my deliverable in the video that I'm providing to the client, 120 frames a second will eat up a good chunk of that commercial spot. And if I only have a 30-second commercial spot and I've got a talking head, I need to put in some B-roll, a couple of product shots, and an end card, I don't think I can burn through the time, the number of seconds to be able to shoot and deliver at 120 frames a second. All right, cool. So once again, like I mentioned, we've got different frame rates. So we've got 24, 30, 60, 120. There are some that go higher. You can go like on the S5, we have a slow and quick mode. I can get up to 180 frames per second that I can use. So once again, look at what you're filming, look at what your needs are, and decide which of the frame rates really apply and make sense for what you're doing. Now, another thing that I'll mention about 30 frames per second, I mentioned that you can record and you can also edit and deliver in 30 frames a second on a timeline. Another thing that you can do, it's a little bit of a cheat for stabilizing, is if you don't have a stabilizer and if you don't want to shoot it in 60 frames a second, you could shoot a walking shot, like somebody walking through a park or someone on a hike. You could shoot that at 30 frames a second and then interpret that footage down to 24 frames a second. And there's about an 18% difference in those frame rates. And you'll be able to cover up just ever so slightly some of the natural movement of someone's body as they're walking. You'll be able to slow that down just a little bit by shooting like a walking shot in 30 frames a second and using it as 24. So as you're filming and shooting, you'll learn to get a feel for what frame rates make the most sense for what you're doing and for your final delivery and how you're going to put together your overall project. So I really encourage people to get out with the camera that you have and just shoot a bunch of shots and try out the different frame rates. Shoot 24 and 30 and 60 and 120 and then come back and see how they look and how that works within your camera. To that point, go out and try all this before you go shoot an actual job and before you go shoot something that you can't go back and reshoot. I'll never forget that one of the first video projects I was on way back when, I was not aware of the issue that I brought up on resolutions, that some cameras only shot 120 frames a second in 720. And I was unaware of that. So I got out to my job and we decided that we wanted to shoot this particular shot in 120 frames a second. So I was like, sure, I can do that. So flip my camera to 120 frames a second, grab the footage. It looked great on the back of the camera, it looked wonderful. Got back into the editing suite with our guys and realized that it shot that at 720. So we had to up-res that, if you will, to 1080, which suffered a little bit on the clarity side. So know your gear before you go out and you actually shoot a job and put it into the field to use it. All right. We had somebody ask about the codecs a second ago, and I was thinking back, and I don't think I've got a particular slide just for this because this is a basic video class, but let's talk about it at this point. This is a really good spot to interject that into our discussion. So when we're talking about shooting with different codecs, and the particular question was about long GOP versus all-I. And so the difference in these is going to be about file size, and it's going to be about compression. And so when you're looking at shooting an either or, it really is depending upon for your editing case. Now, long GOP, what that basically does is that it doesn't go in and interpret every single image while you're filming. It actually will take a series of frames or a series of images, and it will interpret one of them, and the others are assumed to be like it. And so it will just record and it will have more compression. Whereas on an all-I, when you're shooting all-I, then it basically goes in and it's interpreting and looking at and encoding every single of those frames and images. Those tend to be a bigger file size and they're not as compressed. I'm going to make a general statement here that when you're working with that footage like all-I and you're working with that inside of Premiere or Final Cut, it tends to run a little bit faster when you're editing because it's not having to, the editing program is not having to uncompress and work with a compressed file. However, those are going to be bigger file sizes to work with and take up more space. So have I really noticed a major difference between shooting in the two? Not really. It's an editing thing and a file size thing and file management piece. But as far as editing them inside of Premiere, it's not that big of a difference when it comes down to color and being able to work with the footage itself. So I will shoot, the majority of what I shoot is going to be shot in long GOP. And I've not had an issue and it's worked perfectly fine for what I shoot. There have been a few occasions where, based upon the deliverable and the need to be able to deliver a high-res version of my my file, and maybe it's going to go through a different color management process and need to be produced to be shown in a different situation, then maybe I'll go out and I'll shoot in like RAW or something like that. But I've rarely ever used the all-I setting on my camera. Rarely ever. Like I said, most of what I shoot is going to be long GOP. Hopefully that answered the question of the person that asked that. Okay, the next thing to consider and we talk about when we're shooting video is going to be exposure. So this is super, super important, is to understand exposure when we're shooting video. So we've got the three things that we always talk about when we're shooting photography, and we're going to talk about the exact same things when we're shooting video. And that's going to be the typical exposure triangle: ISO, shutter, and aperture. Now, when we're in video if we want to shoot this and just follow the rules, then your shutter should always be double your frame rate. And so if I'm shooting in 24, my shutter is going to be 50. If I'm shooting in 30, it's going to be 60. And if I'm shooting at 60 frames a second, it's going to be 125. Now, that locks that in, and that takes away one aspect of that exposure triangle. That's going to be determined by the frame rate that you actually shoot. Now we're left with ISO, and we're left with aperture. And now we start making decisions. So ISO works like it does in photography. So it's going to be the sensitivity to light, and the higher the ISO, then the more grain or noise that I'm going to introduce into my image. So you have to start thinking about that. Now, I know this is a basic video class, but I just want to make a quick point. When we are shooting on certain cameras, like with our Lumix cameras, then with the S5 and the S1H, I have what's called a dual native ISO. And that allows me to be able to shoot at two different ISOs, a native ISO, which is our low ISO, and a higher ISO. And I'm able to have a clean image on both ends of that spectrum. And so we can talk a little bit about that more a little bit later, but just in case someone's thinking about that or wondering about that, the ISOs, I do introduce more noise and more grain into my image, but on certain cameras, like I just mentioned, we hit a certain point where that image gets cleaned back up. So ISO works like it does in photography. So most of our cameras are going to have a native ISO. And if we're just shooting with standard profiles, standard settings for video, then for most of our cameras, that ISO is going to be 100 or 200. So let's build upon this scenario then as we're thinking through this. If I'm outside on a bright sunny day and I am sitting there with a shutter speed that has to be 50th, and I'm at an ISO of 100, and let's say I set my aperture for 2.8 because I want to blur out my background, chances are my image is going to be overexposed. But if I'm already at the lowest on my shutter that I can go with the frames per second, I'm on the lowest with my ISO, then the only thing I can really change now is going to be my aperture. And so I'm going to have to roll that aperture up and correct my exposure issue using aperture. But what if I don't want to be shooting at an aperture that's going to be at like an f16 or 22 or an 11 or whatever that might be? Then I'll move to the next slide and we'll talk about what the options are to be able to correct that. And I will come back to this comment here about shutter angle in just a moment. So the key for this scenario is going to be the use of filters. So we use them in photography at times. We use polarizers, and we can also use ND filters, neutral density filters. And I typically use the variable neutral density filters, the variable NDs as they're called. And what this basically is, it's sunglasses for your lens is what it is. So going back to my example, if my ISO is at 100, my shutter speed is at 1/50th, and I'd like to keep my aperture right at around a 2.8 roughly, then I can correct and be able to adjust my exposure by using a variable ND. And those will screw right on the top of your lens, screw that right on, and then they rotate. And as you rotate the variable ND filter, then you'll be able to actually see the exposure change on the camera itself. And so if I use a variable ND, now I'd be able to get in and use my ISO 100, a 2.8 for the aperture, shutter speed at 1/50th, use a variable ND to compensate, and now I can get my desired aperture. The one thing I'll mention with using a variable ND to be careful of is just if you take it to the extremes of all the way closed off, you'll start to notice a little bit of a pattern, like a hash pattern that could show up in some discolorization on your image itself. So just be aware of that when you're using the ND filters. Some people like to use ND filters and they come in different stops. So like 1s and 2s and 5s and so on. They come in different stops, like single stops per ND filter. I use a variable ND filter because my lighting scenario and situation changes frequently when I'm shooting. So I don't want to have to take on and off a variable ND filter or ND filter each time that I need to adjust my lighting. So I like to be able just to rotate my ND filter and adjust for the lighting scenario and the situation and take care of it that way. It's kind of like for me in the concept of using zooms. I don't want to have to be taking things on and off when I'm filming. I want to focus on filming and getting that done. The other thing we can talk about here are polarizers. So polarizers can help reduce the glare on reflective surfaces, and they also can be used to saturate and richen up the sky colors that we'll have in the sky, so make the blues bluer and so on. But one of the more common uses of polarizers, if I'm shooting into a windshield of a car or into a glass of a building, I'm able to neutralize that reflection and see into the car or see into the building better by using a polarizer. Going back to aperture, so besides using the ND filter, the aperture really is the only thing that we can change when we start moving with exposure with video. And so at that point, it really becomes a creative choice. So whether you're shooting at a 5.6, an f4, a 2.8, a 1.4, those are all going to be your choices as a filmmaker. And it's all about the focus, how much you want to have in focus and how much that blurred background is important to you. Now, I'm going to go back up here and talk about shutter angle for a second. Shutter angle is something that you'll find in, and I was going to say higher end cameras like the S1H, but we're also getting the shutter angle option that's going to be part of a firmware update to the S5 later this year. And so I'm not going to go super in depth into this, but I just want to say the standard shutter angle for matching up to like our double the frame rate and the shutter being double the frame rate, the standard shutter angle is 180. And that's like that spot that gets us to our double the frame rate for the shutter speed. And so on some of the cameras like the S1H and coming soon in the S5, I can set my shutter angle to be 180. And then as I change from shooting in 24 frames a second, 30 frames a second, 60 frames a second, I don't need to worry about changing and remembering to adjust my shutter speed. Because I set that at 180, then it's automatic. It just takes care of it for me. And so that's something that is out there in some of the cameras that are on the market is the shutter angle option. Usually in the past, you've seen these on larger cameras. I know on the shoulder rig cameras that we use on our show, we use shutter angle versus using the shutter itself to control, obviously, the frame rate and stuff. So, but once again, the S1H and the S5 will have that as an option. All right, so we've talked about exposure triangle. And before I jump into color profiles, I just want to kind of do a quick review here. So we've talked about the resolutions that we film at when we're doing video, main common resolutions, 24, 30, and 60. And then we've talked about, then from that, we've talked about talked about resolutions first, my bad. Resolutions of 720, 1080, and 4K are the resolution options that we have when we're shooting. And then we talked about frame rates being 24, 30, and 60 are the main options that we have. And then we talked about the proper exposure for these settings. Now our resolution and then to our exposure, those two don't have a correlation at all. It's mainly going to be the frame rate and then setting the exposure with the frame rate and the shutter speed. What you will notice and you will see on your resolutions is that your resolutions may also dictate what frame rates you can choose and what frame rates that you have options to actually record in. And so those are going to be varying and different from each of the cameras. Okay, let's talk about color profiles. So color profiles are basically going to be how your color and the dynamic range of your footage is captured. So there's two things when we deal with our color profiles and the way that we're shooting, and that's going to be how much color saturation do we want to have in the image when we record before we take it into post-production, and do we want to utilize the full dynamic range of the sensor? And so like with our cameras, we've got 14 stops of dynamic range in the majority of our cameras, especially in the S series. And so to really achieve and unlock that, I need to consider what color profile I'm going to be shooting in and filming in when I'm creating my footage. So it determines the flexibility we have in post-production. Now I'll say this, for our purposes, if you're a beginning filmmaker and you're just going to get started, shoot in your standard color profile. Just shoot in standard color profile and work with that. That's going to be pretty much what you see is what you get when you're working with the standard color profile. And that's going to be your safe bet. Because as we start talking about some of the other types of color profiles that we can work with, those color profiles are going to require a little bit more time when you're editing, a little bit more finagling with and adjusting and recovering highlights and shadows and saturations and so on. So if you just want to get out and you want to start shooting, and for the first time, for some of y'all, maybe pushing the record button on the camera, just go into the camera and set it up for 24 frames a second, 50th on your shutter. Set your ISO to be at the lowest if you're outside, and just begin to adjust your aperture to where it looks good and shoot a standard picture profile. And that's going to be your quickest way to getting something done, shot, and out there that you can actually use and post online and share with friends and family and so on. That's the quickest way to be able to do that. If you want to dig in a little bit deeper and play a little bit more in the editing process and a little bit more flexibility, we can start talking about some of the other options that we have. So when you are working with your cameras and you go into your picture profile setting, depending on the camera that you have, you'll see different options that are going to show up. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about the options that we have with Lumix. I'm not going to cover every single option that we have, but I'm going to hit some of the key ones that I use for myself when I'm filming. So there's a standard profile, which basically is going to be what you see is what you get. So your colors will look like they are on the screen, and your shadows and the highlights and all of that will look as they are on the screen. Next is going to be flat. So a flat profile just reduces the colors and some of the shadows and the highlights. It just sort of lowers everything down and gives you a little bit more room inside of post-production to play with the image to recover some stuff, but still not going to be a really major process to get through and edit that in post-production. So you can choose a flat image profile. Then next you have what's called a Rec 709, which is close to like broadcast specs. And so with the Rec 709, we have one of those called the Rec 709 inside of Lumix. And that one will give you more dynamic range to play with, more options as far as color and saturations and depth to work with to bring that image out and to recover, if you will, the image. And that's going to be like a Rec 709 setting. And then from there, you go to what's called the HLG 2100. That's just a different spec. And that one's what we call hybrid log gamma. So it's sort of an in-between, not quite as much as a vlog, but not all the way back up to standard or even a Rec 709. It's just a different color space to work within for post-production. And so you've got some options on recovery, a little bit more room to play with your shadows and highlights and color and saturation and so on. That's going to be with the HLG. And then the last one that I'll mention is going to be Vlog. And there's two different variations of Vlog that we have in the cameras. If you're shooting like with the GH5, you're going to have a Vlog L, which is a Vlog Lite. And if you're shooting with like an S1 or the S5, the S1H, then I've got a full Vlog in that one, just a little bit more dynamic range, a little bit more flexibility and post-production for the image itself. I will say this for me, I personally shoot everything in Vlog. I have just found, and this is my personal preference, everyone is different. I have just found for me, I've got my system down that to recover and work with footage in Vlog is easy for me. And it's quick to get it to where I want it to be. And I like having the flexibility to play with that image and to be able to work with the highlights and the shadows and the color itself. When you have an image that's standard, and if you try to play with the standard color profile too much, some things that you'll start to look for and notice when you've pushed an image too far in your color correction and in your working with highlights and shadows is that the colors, when you start pushing them too far, they're going to start looking a little distorted. Reds will not be reds. Blues will not come out looking as blues. The saturations will start getting to be too blown out, if you will, too hot of a color will start to show up on the screen. You'll start getting some artifacts in the color as well, some banding. And then when you're trying to pull back some highlights, if they've been blown out, when you start to pull them back, you'll also get some banding. You'll just start getting some spots that just will not recover at all. Keep this in mind when you're shooting video, that just like with a photo, if I push and I overexpose an area too far and it goes to white, I don't have anything to recover and to pull back on with that footage whatsoever. And then if you're working with shadows and you're trying to pull the shadows back up and to sort of brighten them up some, you'll start to get a lot of noise and grain that'll show up in your footage. And you will also start to then get some color artifacting that'll happen inside of that. So right now on the screen, and I believe the one we're looking at, I think is for standard. Is that correct?
Correct.
That you've pulled up?
Yep, this is
All right.
standard.
So we're going to run through these different options. So the first one's going to be standard. And this is just shot with a standard color profile. Very basic, very simple. And that's what a standard color profile will look like. Now we'll show flat. And that's flat, slightly desaturated, slight little shift and adjustment in the footage itself. And then we'll go to Rec 709. And on some of the other ones that I have now, the rest of them, like the Rec 709, about midway through the clip, I'll show where you can color correct it. And so you can see the difference of the footage as opposed to when it's been color corrected. And so there you see the color corrected version of it. And then we'll do the HLG 2100, same kind of a scenario. That's the HLG. And then as it plays, then you'll see it'll correct itself. I'll apply some color correction to it about midway through. And I just did quick little adjustments here. I didn't try to fine tune them a lot. And the last one we'll look at is Vlog. And I think this is so powerful to see the difference when you're looking at Vlog as opposed to the other kind. There's the Vlog footage. And as you can tell, that is very, very desaturated. Very much a lot of room to be able to go in and correct that footage. So those are your basic color profiles. Like I said, different camera makers will call them different things. But the main things you're going to look at for you, for starting out brand new, look at like a basic or a standard color profile. And if you want to play with log, feel free. It's just going to take a little bit more work to be able to massage that image. All right. One other thing that I'll mention about using different types of color profiles is that it will change the ISO floor that you have available to you. So remember, I talked about ISOs in video. When you start stepping away from your standard color profile, then the low number of your ISO starts to go up. So for example, and I'll give only one example, when I'm shooting in Vlog footage, my ISO floor becomes 640. Not 100, but now I have to start my footage at 640. So you can imagine shooting in Vlog, 640 is my floor. I'm outside. I want to shoot at 2.8. It's a sunny Texas day. I've got to be able to drop on that variable ND filter for sure to be able to correct my exposure and get that in the right exposure range. All right. Any questions coming in at all about color profiles and resolutions and stuff before I move on?
One person was asking, do you ever use auto ISO? I know I tend not to use that because I want to be in control of when that noise creeps in, but definitely I think that's a pretty good question.
Yeah, so I personally never use auto ISO. I just don't like the fact that it's making the decision versus me making the decision. And a really good example of why I never use it. Let's say that I'm filming someone, model, walking outside, and I move from an area. I'm going to change that example. If I'm filming with a model and we're walking outside, it's on a day that maybe it's partly cloudy outside, and maybe in the time that I'm filming her, that the clouds change and shift and go over the sun, I don't want my ISO to creep during that shot at all. I'm okay
Exactly.
with, and chances are I've set the scenario to know that I'm filming outside, it's partly cloudy. I don't want my ISO to adjust midway through that footage.
Yeah,
I want to be in control of that and decide if I want to do that shot again or not. So I don't
exactly.
like that it can do that. Even if you're moving from indoors and outdoors, some people like to use auto ISO to change that. I just feel that the change of that happens so abrupt that it just doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to film indoor shot, get your person walking to the door, cut, and then move to an exterior shot and catch them walking out the door and not worrying about trying to figure out the racking of the ISO. It just doesn't, for me, it doesn't work really well. So I really avoid that. I also will say this on a separate note, it's not on my slides, but the same thing applies to using auto white balance. I don't use auto white balance in anything that I shoot because I don't want the camera picking up little practical lights and changes of lights in certain parts of the scene and trying to adjust and account for that. Just I want to set it and I can deal with it in post-production as I need to.
Yeah, that's totally smart and logical. So cool. We have about
Cool.
14 minutes left of our scheduled time, so it's 1:16 here in Seattle. So I
Awesome.
know we were planning to go until 1:30. So let's go ahead and keep rolling, as they say.
Sounds good. Cool. All right, lighting. So when you're starting out as a filmmaker, lighting is something you have to consider because you can take a really good interview and really good content and it can get destroyed if the lighting isn't right. So a lot of the same concepts that we think about lighting with photography also apply to videography as well. So we want to have soft and flattering light. We also have to consider sun versus shade when we're shooting. And what I mean by that is if you're going to be shooting outdoors, do you put a person in direct sunlight? Most of the time, the answer is going to be no, because we don't want them squinting and just all the other things that come with crazy direct sunlight. So then probably want to put them in the shade and shoot in the shade. And when you're shooting in the shade, you just have to think about your background and where you're going to position that camera angle. And so just be aware of that. If I put someone outside in the shade and they're perfectly exposed, but the background is where the sun is and it's all blown out, that's not a great shot. So be aware of that and how you're going to position that person. And you have to make decisions about hotspots. What are you willing to have blowing out and what are you willing to not have blown out? What's going to be distracting and what's going to enhance and add to the scenes itself? And then when you're shooting indoors, I always choose to be by a window. I like to get that natural light. Top-down lighting that happens indoors is rarely ever flattering and pretty. So I put people by a window. And then at that point, it becomes how do we actually fill in light on the side if we're having a window coming in this direction and need to fill in some shadows, or like in my case, my light's over here. So I've got the lighting in here. And so I need to fill in a little bit of the shadow on my face. And so I'm doing it the budget route. And instead of using a fancy reflector, I always carry little bits of foam board that I pick up at Target. And I have one that's black and I have one that is white. And so I'll just use that to enhance my light and to reflect back in. Sure, I can go and get something a little bit fancier, but a lot of times on the run and gun, this works out really well. And see, I can fill in the shadow on my face even more if I brought this in just a little bit closer. So using simple foam boards is helpful. You may ask why I have the one that's black. I may use black to actually block light. So maybe I've got like a weird lamp or something in this corner that I need to block the light from that lamp because it's casting yellow on my subject. Then I can use the black foam core to be able to cancel that out. When you're dealing with post-production and lighting, it's just hard to fix bad lighting in post-production. It's not like in Photoshop where I can go in and I can fine tune it to some extent. It's really hard to fix bad lighting in post-production with video. I don't have as much flexibility to do that. Basic lighting options, you can use panels are nice. You have a little bit less control over the spread of the light. But for example, this is just a little small light panel that you can use. This one's made by Savage. It's a little RGB 300 that I have. These are great little panels that you can use. You can use bigger ones, obviously, for bigger sets. And then I also use the chip on board, the little LED lights like this one. This is the NAND light. This is a Forza 60. In fact, that's what I'm using to light me right now, is the Forza 60 with a nice softbox on it. So, and these come in bigger sizes. This is 60, 200 to 300 and so on. So those are some of the lighting options that you have that you can bring in as well. If your budget allows it, then bicolor is always the best option. So you have the option to change from 6,000 down to 2,800 or 7,000 to 2,800, just your temperature of the light, whether it's warm or whether it's cool. And so it's nice to be able to have that option for adjusting. Audio with video. So first question with the audio with video is, do you even care? So are you going to be using the audio from the video? If you're not going to be using the audio from your video, then doesn't matter. Don't have to think about it. If you're just going to put a music bed underneath your video, then the audio capturing part doesn't matter at all. Types of audio that we have: on-camera audio, the built-in microphones, we know that's the worst, not the best at all. But if it's all you have, then try to do little things to help it and help filter it. So whether that's putting a little piece of fuzzy on top of the microphone to kind of help block some of the wind, modify it if you can. If not, on-camera shotgun mics work out really well. I'm trying to see if I had mine over here, and I don't. But a shotgun mic that fits on top of the camera and slides in and plugs into your mic jack is really, really great. Also, a lav mic to the camera works really well. And on the lav mics, if you're doing a talking interview with someone, you can go pick up just a really simple lav mic like I have here with a long cable, plug that into your camera, get an extension for it, and clip it to your person and record audio directly to the camera, and just use a simple lav mic. You can get these at most camera stores for 20, 25 bucks. And that's a great way to get clean audio without really going into expense of moving into like a wireless lav system, like I have mentioned over here as well, such as like the Blink system or a UHF wireless system, the lav mics. Those can get a little pricey, so just depends on your budget. And then also using external recorders is another way to capture audio to use in your video. The Zoom series is great. I have a Zoom H4 that I use, and I also have a little H1, a smaller one, that I'll use when recording in the field as well. One of the things to pay attention to with your audio is make sure you can see the audio levels on your camera screen when you're recording, and pay attention to and try to keep them between -12 and -9 as far as your audio settings. If you go to 0, you've blown it out. And a lot of the cameras will show you, and you'll be in green to yellow and then red. So try to keep it in the green with maybe a peek into just a smidge of yellow, but really try to keep it at the -12 to the -9 area when you're recording. And then of course, when you're using music, just beware of the copyright. That definitely can cause an issue, and you do not want to get sued or get a copyright strike on YouTube or anything like that at all. So check out the YouTube music library. They've got some songs that you can pull and you can use. It's free. I use Artlist and I use Epidemic Sound for my audio for my videos. And so those are two that I recommend that people can use. All right. So that takes care of lighting and the basic audio for video. One thing too is when you're recording audio, make sure that you invest in some decent headphones, especially if you're doing a talking head. So I use some over-the-ear, these nice little, these are made by Sony that I picked up. They're monitoring headphones. And so just make sure you get the kind that go over your ears. That'll help isolate the sound, and you'll really be able to tell if you're capturing good audio and if you have anything that's distracting. You'd be very surprised about what can be distracting in your final audio. It can be every so slight things that you may not hear unless you're isolating it. Things like a car driving by, a diesel truck driving by, the air conditioner got turned on, somebody down the hallway slammed the door and the reverberation of that got picked up. So there's just all kinds of little things that if you just use a little earbud, you really can't pick up. So I really encourage the over-the-ear microphone, I mean, over-the-ear headphones for when you're monitoring. It'll definitely give you a cleaner monitoring of your audio itself. All right. And the last thing I'm going to mention briefly here is storytelling. So we spent a whole lot of time talking about the technical aspect, the lighting, the audio, and all of that. But if the videos don't make sense, then none of that really matters. So pay attention to storytelling whenever you're filming, especially if you're doing a commercial job and working with a client. Put the video in context, the location, why you're here, what you're doing. Think about how you want the video to begin, but also think about how you want the video to end as well. There needs to be a beginning and an end that makes sense, that wraps it up. And a lot of times people will forget about the ending part of the video. And then all the things you need to do to fill it in. The main subject that you're filming, whether it's a talking head or an interview, think about the things that are happening around, listen to what they're talking about, and decide if you need to cut away to some B-roll. Maybe it's a chef talking about cutting something and cooking something, and maybe you want B-roll of knife actions or mixing in a bowl, putting something into the oven. Just there's all different kinds of things you have to think about that tell that story, because just staring at someone for 5 minutes talking at times cannot be the most entertaining thing. So look for ways to make your video really stand out and to tell the story. Just don't forget about telling the story. I really can't emphasize that enough whenever you're shooting. All right, so that covers a lot of what I had to talk about today. I know that was a lot. So if you have questions, please feel free. I think some people have been asking them throughout the session. But if there's more questions that roll in, I'll keep an eye on the video too whenever it goes to YouTube, and can jump in and help answer questions as well. But other than that, that's what I've got for today. I hope you guys learned something. I hope you have got a good baseline to start off with for diving into video, hitting that red record button on your camera, and shifting a little bit about the mindset from just stills, but looking at video as well in your content creation. Cool. Any questions or anything?
Well, that was really great. We did get a couple of those answered along the way. Someone was asking about panning smoothly. They were asking about the codecs earlier, and it's kind of the same person. So they were trying to just, do you have like a couple of other tips to talk about panning smoothly? I feel like you covered a lot of it. And that person is now saying thanks. So it sounds like
Cool.
maybe you hit on what they were asking about.
on the panning smoothly, I really think it has to do with getting the right video head for your tripod. So that's really about that nice level tripod and having that tension to be able to pan smoothly, but also use your body for that too. If you're doing a handheld shot, just think about your body and learn to isolate your movements. So your top part of your body is all that's going to move whenever you're panning for that. And same thing with tilting. It may look funny, but who cares? If you're doing this, it works,
As long as you get the shot, right?
Most people don't look pretty when they're filming. So I'm like, just get the shot.
I would say the same thing as a photographer as well. I'm a still photographer, and there's definitely some positions you kind of get yourself in to get that shot, and you're like, yeah. I have this one friend who took photos of some skyscrapers in New York, and he like laid in the middle of the sidewalk, and I was like, that is a bold move in New York,
Yeah. Yep. Been there, done that.
Yeah, I think most of us have if we've been there. So just great thank yous and comments and stuff from those who have tuned in. So I think we'll call that a wrap for now. I just want to thank you so much for your time and all of that great information. It's definitely a great primer on those of us like me who are doing a little bit of video, like I do a little bit of video, but the joke is like I never edit it. So that's the barrier that keeps me from doing more. But it's, you've heard that before, I'm sure.
Well, think about the joke of people that bought a GoPro and have so much great footage that they've never edited because they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, so that's Devin. Apparently, he's pointing at himself right now. Yep. But also, like, I have tons of footage from road trips and travel around the world that sits on hard drives. So I probably should have spent more time during this whole work from home all over the place to video editing. Anyhow, So we'll just go ahead and wrap this up. First of all, thank you so much for your time and all of that great information. Like I said before, it really is super beneficial to those who are tuning in. We're not done today. We do have another Panasonic session that will start in just about half an hour, and that's going to be with Mark Toll and Michael Richardson, and they're going to talk about the differences between full frame and micro four thirds and why you might choose one over the other. So it's going to be totally a positive experience, not, some kind of battle, just so you know. And then I did want to mention, along with like these secret special super offers that you just need to sign up and go get, there are some other promotions happening in the store this weekend. So if you want to swing by today before we close, you could take advantage of whatever Panasonic promos might be happening, or also lighting promos, because today is also the last day of our lighting week. So you mentioned some lights in the session, and it got us thinking like, oh, lighting week is still happening. Maybe we should just let people know that so they could save a little bit of money right now. So give the store a call, come and see us. We are here for you today, all right? Todd, thank you so much. Mark, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And Rick, hanging out in the background. Don't leave when we go offline, because I have a quick question before you take off. And then Mark, we'll be live with you in just 30 minutes, 2 p.m. If you did register, check your email for that super secret promotion that's happening this weekend only. Actually, that ends today too, so don't delay. All right, thank you everybody. Have a great day. Come back in half an hour and watch us more and learn more about Lumix cameras.
See you then.